The morning of June 22nd, 1941, 4 a.m. Moscow time. Along a front stretching from the Baltic Sea to the Black Sea, 3.5 million German soldiers begin the largest military operation in human history. Operation Barbarossa has commenced. In the tank parks of Army Group Center, Panzer crews perform final equipment checks on their Panzer III and Panzer IV medium tanks, the backbone of Germany's armored divisions. These machines represent the pinnacle of German engineering doctrine. Advanced optics, sophisticated transmissions, and thick frontal armor designed to dominate any battlefield. What none of these crews realize, what the German High Command refuses to acknowledge, is that within 18 months, 83% of their destroyed comrades will fall not to superior enemy tanks, but to a weapon system Germany's military leadership has systematically dismissed as obsolete, primitive, and tactically irrelevant. The Soviet anti-tank gun would prove to be Nazi Germany's most underestimated nemesis. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. To understand this strategic blindness, we must examine the intellectual foundations of German armored doctrine. Since 1935, when Germany openly violated the Treaty of Versailles and began massive rearmament, German tank development had followed a specific philosophy. Tanks fought tanks. Anti-tank guns were defensive weapons for infantry formations lacking proper armored support. This thinking dominated German military academies throughout the 1930s. Colonel Heinz Guderian, the father of German armored tactics, wrote extensively about tank versus tank combat in his influential work Achtung Panzer, published in 1937. The book contained detailed analyses of penetration values, armor thickness calculations, and velocity measurements for tank guns. Anti-tank guns received exactly 4 paragraphs across 300 pages. The German Army's training manuals reflected this bias. Tank crews practiced engaging other tanks at ranges exceeding 1,000 meters. They studied the weak points of enemy armor, learned to estimate range using their sophisticated optics, and drilled on ammunition selection for different targets. Anti-tank gun threats were covered in a single afternoon session, focused primarily on how to spot camouflaged positions. This doctrinal foundation seemed validated by Germany's early victories. In Poland, during September 1939, German armored divisions encountered Polish anti-tank guns, but overwhelmed them through concentrated attacks and close air support. The Polish 37mm Bofors guns achieved some success, but German tank losses remained light. France, in May 1940, reinforced German confidence. The 47mm anti-tank guns used by French forces proved largely ineffective against German armor when properly employed. Most French anti-tank guns were positioned poorly, lacked adequate infantry support, and were abandoned when German tanks maneuvered around them. The Norwegian campaign, the Low Countries, the Balkans, EC, each victory strengthened German belief that properly handled tanks could overcome static anti-tank defenses. By June 1941, as German columns rolled toward Moscow, Leningrad, and Stalingrad, tank crews had developed an almost casual disregard for towed anti-tank weapons. Lieutenant Franz Weber, a Panzer III commander with the 3rd Panzer Division, wrote in his diary on June 24, 1941, "The Russians have some anti-tank guns, but they're poorly handled. Our tactics and equipment are superior. We advance, spot their positions, and eliminate them with high-explosive shells from beyond their effective range." The foundation of German confidence rested on legitimate technical advantages. The Panzer III OSF-J, standard equipment for many units in 1941, carried 50mm of frontal armor and mounted a long-barreled 50mm gun. Soviet 34 tanks were superior in many respects, but German crews had better training, superior optics, and more reliable radios. German intelligence estimates from spring 1941 identified Soviet anti-tank guns as their primary threat, but dismissed their tactical significance. A Wehrmacht intelligence summary from May 1941 stated, Soviet anti-tank defenses rely primarily on 45mm guns of limited penetration. These weapons lack the velocity necessary to defeat modern German armor at combat ranges. The assessment was technically accurate, but strategically catastrophic. It focused on individual weapon performance while ignoring tactical employment, terrain advantages, and most critically, Soviet production capacity and tactical adaptation. The first hints of trouble emerged during the opening weeks of Barbarossa. German tank crews began reporting unexpected encounters with well-positioned anti-tank guns that didn't behave according to German tactical expectations. Instead of revealing themselves at long range, Soviet gunners held fire until German tanks approached within 300 meters, then opened fire with devastating accuracy. Obergefreiter Kurt Kellner, a radio operator with the 7th Panzer Division, described an engagement near Minsk on July 2, 1941. We advanced toward what appeared to be an abandoned village. At 200 meters, the world exploded. 3 anti-tank guns opened fire simultaneously from positions we couldn't see. 2 of our tanks were hit before we could respond. These early encounters followed a pattern German crews struggled to understand. Soviet anti-tank guns weren't engaging in long-range duels. They were using concealment, patience, and close-range ambush, tactics that neutralized German advantages in optics and armor thickness. The Soviet 45mm model 1937 anti-tank gun, dismissed by German intelligence as inadequate, proved deadly effective at ranges under 400 meters. Its armor-piercing round could penetrate 43 millimeters of armor at 300 meters, sufficient to defeat most German tank side armor and many frontal plates at close range. More importantly, Soviet crews were learning to target specific areas. Instead of aiming for the thickest frontal armor, they targeted track systems, vision ports, and gun mantlets. A 45mm round that penetrated the driver's vision port would kill or wound the driver and commander, effectively eliminating the tank, even if the vehicle remained mechanically functional. By August 1941, German tank loss reports began revealing a disturbing pattern. Tank casualties attributed to anti-tank guns were increasing while tank versus tank losses remained relatively constant. A Panzer regiment commander with Army Group Center noted in his after-action report, "Anti-tank gun encounters now account for approximately 40% of our tank losses, significantly higher than anticipated." The German response followed predictable patterns. Artillery preparation increased, infantry-tank cooperation improved, close air support was called more frequently, but the fundamental assumption remained unchanged. Anti-tank guns were obstacles to be overcome, not primary threats requiring doctrinal revision. This intellectual rigidity would prove costly as Soviet anti-tank capabilities evolved rapidly throughout late 1941 and early 1942. The Red Army was learning that properly employed anti-tank guns could stop German armored advances, but only if those guns were positioned, supplied, and supported according to principles German doctrine refused to acknowledge. The winter of 1941 brought crisis to German forces outside Moscow. Extreme cold affected mechanical reliability, supply lines stretched beyond practical limits, and Soviet resistance stiffened dramatically. Tank crews discovered that their sophisticated equipment performed poorly in temperatures that dropped to -40 degrees Fahrenheit. Meanwhile, Soviet anti-tank gun production accelerated. Factory cities beyond the Urals began mass-producing improved versions of existing designs while developing new weapons specifically optimized for defeating German armor. The ZIS 376.2mm anti-tank gun entered production in late 1941 with penetration characteristics that could defeat any German tank in service. German intelligence continued to focus on individual weapon specifications while missing the larger transformation occurring within Soviet anti-tank doctrine. Red Army commanders were developing integrated defense systems, where anti-tank guns functioned as key components in elaborate tactical schemes involving infantry, artillery, engineers, and air support. The spring offensives of 1942 brought these evolved Soviet tactics into sharp focus. German tank commanders discovered that Soviet anti-tank defenses had become layered, mobile, and mutually supporting. Instead of isolated guns waiting to be flanked, they faced coordinated networks where destroying one position merely revealed another. Captain Hans Richter, commanding a company of Panzer IVs with the 4th Panzer Army, wrote after the Battle of Kharkov in May 1942, "We can no longer assume that eliminating visible anti-tank positions clears our path. The Russians have learned to position guns in depth with overlapping fields of fire. When we engage the first line, the second opens fire from our flanks." The evolution of Soviet anti-tank tactics represented more than tactical adaptation. It reflected a fundamental understanding that towed anti-tank guns, properly employed, could achieve strategic effects far exceeding their individual capabilities. German doctrine continued to view anti-tank guns as defensive weapons. Soviet doctrine increasingly employed them offensively, using mobility and concealment to achieve surprise against advancing German armor. By summer 1942, the statistical evidence was becoming undeniable. German tank loss analysis for the period January through June 1942 showed that 57% of tank casualties resulted from anti-tank gunfire. Tank versus tank combat accounted for only 28% of losses, with the remainder attributed to mines, artillery, and aircraft. Yet German training priorities remained focused on tank gunnery, armor tactics, and mechanical maintenance. Anti-tank gun recognition and evasion techniques received minimal attention. Tank crews continued to train primarily for engaging other tanks, even as battlefield evidence demonstrated that their primary threat came from concealed anti-tank positions. The disconnect between training and reality created a psychological burden for German tank crews. They had prepared extensively for dramatic tank battles, but found themselves primarily fighting a nearly invisible enemy that struck without warning and disappeared before retaliation was possible. Unteroffizier Wilhelm Strauss, a gunner with the 24th Panzer Division, captured this frustration in a letter home dated August 15, 1942. "We trained to fight the enemy's tanks. Instead, we're fighting ghosts. Anti-tank guns appear from nowhere, fire once or twice, then vanish. By the time we locate them, they've moved or been withdrawn." The autumn battles of 1942 marked a turning point in German recognition of the anti-tank gun threat. The fighting around Stalingrad brought German tank crews face-to-face with Soviet anti-tank defenses that had evolved into something approaching perfection. Soviet engineers had learned to create killing fields where anti-tank guns could engage German armor at optimal ranges, while remaining protected from return fire. These positions were camouflaged with techniques that defeated German reconnaissance, positioned to take advantage of terrain features that channeled tank movement and supported by infantry units trained specifically in anti-tank defense. The Battle of Stalingrad became a laboratory for Soviet anti-tank tactics. Urban terrain provided ideal concealment for anti-tank guns, which could be positioned in buildings, behind rubble, or in prepared positions that appeared abandoned until German tanks approached within effective range. Major Otto Hoffmann, a battalion commander with the 14th Panzer Division, submitted a detailed report on Soviet anti-tank tactics observed during the Stalingrad fighting. His analysis identified specific innovations that had transformed anti-tank gun effectiveness. Depth, positioning. Soviet guns were positioned in multiple layers, forcing German tanks to expose themselves to subsequent positions while engaging forward elements. Mobility emphasis. Anti-tank guns were being moved frequently, preventing German forces from targeting known positions with artillery or airstrikes. Coordination with infantry, AC. Soviet anti-tank crews worked closely with infantry units trained to protect guns from German infantry attacks and provide targeting information. Ammunition management, AIC. Soviet crews had learned to hold fire until optimal engagement opportunities, conserving ammunition while achieving maximum effect per round fired. These tactical innovations represented a systematic approach to anti-tank defense that German doctrine had never anticipated. German training emphasized individual weapon performance and small unit tactics. Soviet development focused on integrating anti-tank weapons into larger defensive systems that multiplied their effectiveness through coordination and mutual support. The winter fighting of 1942 and 1943 brought the crisis to a head. German tank losses continued climbing, while replacement rates declined. More critically, the quality of replacement crews decreased, as experienced personnel became casualties and training time shortened to meet urgent replacement needs. New German tank crews arrived at the front with minimal anti-tank gun recognition training and no experience in the evasion techniques that veteran crews had developed through bitter experience. These inexperienced crews proved particularly vulnerable to Soviet anti-tank ambushes, creating a cycle where losses accelerated as crew quality declined. The statistics became impossible to ignore. German Army records for the period October 1942 through March 1943 showed that 71% of tank losses resulted from anti-tank gunfire. The weapon system German doctrine had dismissed as tactically irrelevant had become the primary killer of German armor. Yet institutional response remained limited. Training modifications focused on technical improvements, EAS, better optics, improved armor, upgraded guns, AAS, rather than tactical adaptation to address the anti-tank gun threat. German military culture valued technological solutions over doctrinal revision. The spring of 1943 brought Operation Citadel, Germany's last major offensive on the Eastern Front. The Kursk salient offered an opportunity to test whether improved German technology could overcome evolved Soviet anti-tank tactics. The results would provide definitive answers about the effectiveness of anti-tank guns against modern German armor. July 5, 1943, 0430 hours. The Kursk salient. Obergefreiter Klaus Brenner sits in the driver's compartment of his Panzer IV Osv H, part of the 2nd SS Panzer Division Das Reich. Around him, nearly 3,000 German tanks and assault guns prepare for Operation Citadel, the largest armoured offensive in military history. The new Panzer IV carries 75 mm of frontal armour and mounts the long-barreled 75 mm gun, specifically designed to outrange and outpenetrate any Soviet anti-tank weapon. German intelligence estimates suggest they face approximately 2,300 Soviet tanks in the salient. What intelligence has failed to calculate is that those tanks are protected by more than 6,000 anti-tank guns positioned in defensive belts, stretching 40 miles deep. The mathematical reality of Operation Citadel will not be decided by tank versus tank combat, but by how many German tanks can survive passage through the most sophisticated anti-tank killing fields ever constructed. The German plan for Citadel reflected supreme confidence in technological superiority. Army Group South would attack northward from Belgorod, while Army Group Center struck southward from Orel. The two forces would meet near Kursk, encircling Soviet forces in a classic pincer movement. Tank crews had been briefed extensively on enemy tank capabilities, but received minimal information about anti-tank gun threats. Klaus Brenner's tank commander, Unterscharführer Franz Kohler, had survived 38 tank battles since June 1941. His experience with anti-tank guns had taught him lessons that contradicted official doctrine. The night before Citadel began, he gathered his crew for an unofficial briefing that focused entirely on anti-tank gun recognition and evasion. "Forget what they taught you about engaging enemy tanks at long range," Kohler explained. "The real threat comes from guns you can't see until they fire. Watch for unnatural shadows, straight lines in vegetation, anything that doesn't belong. When we take fire from an anti-tank position, we don't stop to engage. We move immediately and call for artillery support." Kohler's practical wisdom represented 2 years of bitter learning, but it contradicted German tactical doctrine that emphasized aggressive frontal attacks and decisive engagement of enemy forces. Official pre-battle orders stressed the importance of rapid advances to prevent Soviet forces from establishing defensive positions. At 0430, German artillery began the largest bombardment in military history. More than 10,000 guns fired continuously for 2 hours, delivering over 1 million rounds across the Soviet defensive positions. The barrage was designed to destroy anti-tank guns, eliminate command posts, and demoralize Soviet defenders before German tanks advanced. Soviet defensive preparations had anticipated this bombardment. Anti-tank guns were positioned in prepared shelters with overhead cover designed to withstand everything except direct hits. Dummy positions, equipped with wooden guns, drew German fire away from actual weapons. Most critically, the deepest anti-tank gun positions were company located beyond the range of German artillery, positioned to engage tanks that had already penetrated the first defensive belts. When the barrage lifted at 0630, Klaus Brenner engaged his transmission and followed the tank ahead through a gap in German minefields. The advance began according to plan. German tanks moved forward in company formations, maintaining intervals that allowed mutual support while preventing concentrated anti-tank fire from engaging multiple vehicles simultaneously. The first Soviet anti-tank positions revealed themselves at 0715. 45mm guns positioned in the forward defensive belt opened fire at ranges exceeding 800 meters, well beyond their effective penetration distance. These guns were not attempting to destroy German tanks, but to reveal their positions to observers directing artillery fire from deeper positions. Kohler understood the tactical purpose immediately. Driver, hard left. They're spotting for their artillery. Brenner swung the tank toward a small depression as the first Soviet artillery rounds began falling. Around them, other German tanks continued advancing according to doctrine, maintaining formation and attempting to identify anti-tank gun positions for suppression fire. The artillery strike lasted 6 minutes and destroyed 4 German tanks in Klaus's immediate area. The anti-tank guns that had revealed the German positions were abandoned before German return fire could eliminate them. By 0730, Soviet crews had moved to alternate positions and resumed observation duties. This pattern repeated continuously as German forces advanced through the first defensive belt. Anti-tank guns would fire enough rounds to identify German positions, then withdraw or remain silent, while artillery engaged the revealed targets. German tank crews found themselves fighting an enemy that refused decisive engagement while continuously calling down devastating indirect fire. Major Wilhelm Stever, commanding a battalion of Panzer IVs with the 3rd Panzer Division, reported by radio at 0845, "We're taking continuous fire from positions we can't locate. Anti-tank guns are engaging and displacing faster than we can respond. Request immediate air support for reconnaissance and suppression." The Luftwaffe response revealed another dimension of Soviet preparation. German Stuka dive bombers attempting to locate and destroy anti-tank positions encountered intense anti-aircraft fire from guns positioned specifically to protect anti-tank weapons. Soviet air defense had been integrated with anti-tank defense to create mutually supporting systems that protected both types of weapons. By mid-morning, German tank crews were discovering that penetrating the first defensive belt merely exposed them to more sophisticated anti-tank positions in the second belt. These guns were larger, better concealed, and positioned to engage German tanks that had already been weakened by earlier encounters. The ZS-3 76.2mm anti-tank gun proved particularly devastating. Its armor-piercing round could penetrate 108mm of armor at 500 meters, sufficient to defeat any German tank except the new Tiger I from frontal aspects. More importantly, ZS-3 crews had been trained specifically to engage German tanks at ranges where German return fire was less effective. Klaus Brenner's tank encountered its first ZS-3 at 10:30 a.m. while advancing through a wheat field south of Olkovatka. The Soviet gun was positioned behind a small farmhouse, invisible until the tank crested a low ridge approximately 400 meters away. Kohler spotted the gun barrel protruding through a carefully constructed firing port and screamed, "Anti-tank gun, 2 o'clock, 400. Brenner immediately turned the tank to present the strongest frontal armor, while their gunner, Obergefreiter Hans Richter, traversed the turret toward the target. The engagement lasted 8 seconds. The ZIS-3 fired first, its round striking the tank's frontal armor and deflecting upward with a shower of sparks. Richter's return shot struck the farmhouse wall, but the anti-tank gun had already been withdrawn through a prepared exit route. "They're gone," Kohler reported. "Continue advance. Watch for secondary positions." This engagement pattern became standard throughout the day. German tanks would locate anti-tank positions, engage them briefly, then discover the guns had been moved or abandoned. Meanwhile, new positions would reveal themselves from unexpected directions. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. By afternoon, the statistical reality of Citadel was becoming clear. German tank losses were mounting rapidly, but very few resulted from tank versus tank combat. Soviet tank crews were avoiding decisive engagements, preferring to withdraw when confronted by superior German armor. The killing was being done by anti-tank guns that engaged German tanks under optimal conditions, then disappeared before retaliation was possible. Lieutenant Colonel Ernst Hoffmann, commanding a Panzer regiment with the 11th Panzer Division, submitted his first daily loss report at 1800 hours on July 5th. Of 32 tanks rendered non-operational, 26 had been hit by anti-tank guns. Only 4 losses resulted from tank combat, with 2 additional tanks lost to mines. These statistics contradicted every assumption underlying German tactical doctrine. Tank crews had trained extensively for tank versus tank engagements that were proving rare. Meanwhile, they faced continuous threats from weapons they had been taught to consider secondary. The evening of July 5th brought a stark realization to German commanders at all levels. Soviet anti-tank defenses were not obstacles to be overcome, but integrated systems designed to destroy German armor through systematic attrition. Each defensive belt contained hundreds of anti-tank guns positioned to create overlapping fields of fire that channeled German tanks into killing zones. Klaus Brenner's crew lagered for the night in a defensive position they shared with 2 other tanks from their company. During the darkness, Kohler conducted an informal after-action review with the other tank commanders. Their collective experience from the first day of Citadel revealed patterns that challenged fundamental assumptions about armored warfare. "We engaged 12 anti-tank positions today," reported Oberfeldwebel Kurt Steiner, commander of Tank No. 421. "We destroyed maybe 3 guns, but I'm not certain about any of them. The rest withdrew or displaced before we could confirm kills. Meanwhile, they hit 6 of our tanks and knocked out 3 permanently." The mathematics were becoming undeniable. German tanks were achieving very low kill rates against anti-tank guns while suffering heavy losses in return. The technological advantages that German doctrine emphasized, superior optics, better guns, thicker armor, MOA, provided minimal benefit against enemies who refused to engage under conditions that favored German equipment. July 6th brought innovations in Soviet anti-tank tactics that further increased German losses. Instead of engaging from static positions, anti-tank guns began using mobile tactics that took advantage of superior knowledge of local terrain. Guns would fire from one position, displace rapidly to alternate locations, then engage again before German tanks could respond effectively. Technical Sergeant Ivan Petrov, commanding a ZS-3 crew with the 13th Guards Anti-Tank Regiment, had developed techniques that maximized his gun's effectiveness against German armor. His crew could displace their gun 300 meters in under 4 minutes, allowing them to engage German tanks from multiple positions during a single encounter. "We fire 2 rounds maximum from each position," Petrov explained to newly arrived crew members. "First round aims for track or road wheel to immobilize the target. Second round targets the turret ring or driver's vision port. Then we move immediately to position number 2 and repeat the process." These tactics proved devastatingly effective against German tanks attempting to locate and suppress anti-tank positions. By the time German crews identified the source of fire and brought their guns to bear, the Soviet anti-tank gun had moved to a different location and resumed firing from an unexpected direction. The psychological effect on German tank crews was severe. Veterans like Kohler adapted by developing counter-tactics that emphasized rapid movement and immediate withdrawal when taking anti-tank fire. But newly arrived crews, trained according to doctrine that emphasized aggressive engagement, continued, attempting to fight anti-tank guns using methods that proved suicidal. Unteroffizier Paul Weber, a tank commander with the 23rd Panzer Division, wrote in his diary on July 7th, "The anti-tank guns are everywhere and nowhere. We advance, take fire, turn to engage, and find empty positions. Meanwhile, fire begins from a new direction. My nerves are completely shattered." German attempts to counter Soviet anti-tank tactics followed predictable patterns. Artillery preparation increased, infantry-tank cooperation improved. Air support was requested more frequently, but the fundamental problem remained unsolved. German doctrine provided no effective methods for dealing with mobile anti-tank guns that refused decisive engagement. The Battle of Prokhorovka on July 12 demonstrated the ultimate evolution of Soviet anti-tank tactics. While attention focused on the massive tank battle occurring in the open steppe, the decisive action occurred around the periphery where hundreds of anti-tank guns engaged German armor attempting to maneuver for advantageous positions. Klaus Brenner's tank was hit by a ZS-3 round at 14:30 hours while advancing toward Hill 252. The round struck the tank's right track, severing it completely and immobilizing the vehicle. Kohler immediately ordered the crew to abandon the tank, recognizing that immobilized German armor became priority targets for concentrated anti-tank fire. "Everybody out! Move to the depression at 2 o'clock. Hans, bring the machine gun and ammunition." The crew evacuated their tank within 30 seconds and reached cover just as a second anti-tank round struck the abandoned Panzer IV's turret, penetrating the armor and igniting the ammunition storage. From their position in a shell crater, Klaus watched as Soviet anti-tank guns systematically engaged German tanks throughout the sector. The guns appeared from concealed positions, fired until their targets were destroyed or driven off, then disappeared before German return fire could eliminate them. The statistical results of Prokhorovka proved catastrophic for German armoured forces. Total German tank losses exceeded 300 vehicles, with post-battle analysis revealing that over 250 had been destroyed by anti-tank guns rather than enemy tanks. The weapon system German doctrine dismissed as tactically irrelevant had achieved a kill ratio exceeding 80%. By July 13th, Operation Citadel was effectively finished. German tank strength had been reduced below levels necessary to continue offensive operations. More critically, the pattern of losses revealed that German armoured doctrine was fundamentally flawed when confronted with sophisticated anti-tank defences. The final statistics from Citadel provided undeniable evidence of anti-tank gun effectiveness. German army records showed that of approximately 1,200 tanks lost during the operation, more than 950 had been destroyed by anti-tank guns. Tank versus tank combat accounted for fewer than 150 German tank losses. These numbers represented more than tactical failure. They demonstrated that German military thinking had completely misunderstood the nature of modern armoured warfare. The assumption that tanks fought primarily against other tanks proved false when confronted with enemies who integrated anti-tank weapons into comprehensive defensive systems. Klaus Brenner survived Kursk and continued fighting until captured near Budapest in January 1945. After the war, he reflected on the lessons of Citadel. "We trained to fight their tanks and ignored their anti-tank guns. That ignorance cost us the war." The transformation of anti-tank guns from dismissed weapons to primary tank killers represented one of World War II's most significant tactical evolutions. It proved that technological superiority meant nothing without doctrinal adaptation, that training, focused on the wrong threats, created vulnerabilities that enemies could exploit, and that institutional blindness to uncomfortable realities carried catastrophic consequences. The 83% figure in our title reflects the culmination of this evolution. By late 1943, anti-tank guns had become responsible for the vast majority of German tank losses on the Eastern Front. The weapon Germany completely ignored had become their primary nemesis. Part 3. The aftermath of Operation Citadel marked a turning point, not just in the war, but in military understanding of armoured warfare itself. German tank crews who survived the Kursk battles returned to their units carrying knowledge that contradicted everything their training had emphasized. They had witnessed the systematic destruction of German armour by weapons their doctrine considered obsolete. Hauptmann Friedrich Schulze, a company commander with the Grossdeutschland Division, submitted a detailed after-action report in August 1943 that captured the magnitude of doctrinal failure. His analysis was brutally direct. Our training prepared us for tank battles that rarely occurred. Meanwhile, we faced continuous attacks from anti-tank guns, for which we had no effective counter-tactics. The statistical evidence became impossible to deny. Wehrmacht loss records for the entire Eastern Front during the second half of 1943 showed that anti-tank guns accounted for 78% of German tank casualties. Tank versus tank combat, the focus of German training and doctrine, resulted in only 14% of losses. The remaining 8% came from mines, artillery, and aircraft. But changing institutional thinking proved more difficult than acknowledging statistical reality. German military culture valued technological solutions over tactical adaptation. Instead of revising doctrine to address anti-tank gun threats, German engineers focused on developing better tanks with thicker armor and more powerful guns. The Panzer tank, introduced at Kursk despite mechanical problems, represented this technological approach. Its frontal armor was nearly impervious to most Soviet anti-tank guns, and its 75mm gun could engage targets at ranges exceeding 2,000 meters. German planners believed technological superiority would overcome tactical disadvantages. Soviet response demonstrated the futility of this approach. Instead of developing bigger anti-tank guns to penetrate Panzer armor, Soviet forces refined their tactical methods to target Panzer vulnerabilities. Side armor remained relatively thin. Track systems were exposed. Vision ports provided penetration opportunities for smaller guns firing at close range. The Battle of Brody in July 1944 illustrated the evolution of Soviet anti-tank tactics against improved German armor. The 4th Panzer Army, equipped primarily with Panther and Tiger tanks, encountered anti-tank defenses that had been specifically designed to engage heavy German armor using coordinated attacks from multiple directions. Obergefreiter Hans Müller, a Panther driver with the 1st SS Panzer Division, described the engagement. They didn't try to penetrate our frontal armor. Instead, they maneuvered multiple guns to fire simultaneously at our sides and rear. Even the Panther couldn't survive concentrated fire from 3 different directions. The tactical sophistication of Soviet anti-tank operations by 1944 approached the level of art. Anti-tank guns were integrated with infantry, artillery, engineers, and air support to create defensive systems that could stop German armored attacks, regardless of the quality or quantity of German tanks involved. Senior Lieutenant Mikhail Volkov, commanding an anti-tank battery with the 3rd Guards Army, developed techniques that became standard throughout Soviet forces. His methods emphasized patience, coordination, and precise timing rather than individual weapon performance. "We study German tank tactics and position our guns accordingly," Volkov explained in a training manual distributed to other units. German tanks advance in predictable formations. They expose their flanks when maneuvering around obstacles. They bunch together when taking artillery fire. Each German habit becomes an opportunity for anti-tank crews who understand how to exploit these patterns. German attempts to counter these evolved Soviet tactics proved largely ineffective. Tank crews developed improved techniques for spotting camouflaged anti-tank positions, but Soviet concealment methods improved faster than German detection capabilities. Artillery preparation against suspected anti-tank positions increased, but Soviet dummy positions and mobility frustrated most bombardments. The fundamental problem remained doctrinal. German training continued, emphasizing tank versus tank combat even as battlefield. Evidence demonstrated that anti-tank guns posed the primary threat. New tank crews arrived at the front with minimal knowledge of anti-tank gun recognition and evasion techniques. Lieutenant Karl Weber, a Tiger commander with the 501st Heavy Panzer Battalion, wrote in September 1944, "The replacement crews know everything about engaging enemy tanks but nothing about surviving anti-tank guns. They last an average of 4 days before being knocked out by guns they never saw." The psychological toll on German tank crews became severe as the war progressed. Veterans like Klaus Brenner developed almost supernatural awareness of anti-tank gun threats, but new crews suffered catastrophic losses because they lacked this hard-won knowledge. Technical Sergeant Otto Hoffmann, a tank commander who survived from 1941 through 1945, described the mental burden. "Every advance became a nightmare. You knew anti-tank guns were watching, waiting for the perfect moment to fire. But you couldn't see them, couldn't predict when they would strike. the stress was unbearable. German tank production increased dramatically during 1944, reaching peak monthly outputs that exceeded Soviet tank production. But these new tanks were crewed by increasingly inexperienced personnel who fell victim to anti-tank tactics that veteran crews might have survived. The Battle of Normandy provided additional evidence of anti-tank gun effectiveness against German armor. Allied forces had studied Soviet anti-tank tactics and adapted them for Western European terrain. German tank crews discovered that the lessons learned on the Eastern Front applied with equal devastation in France. The British 17-pounder anti-tank gun proved particularly effective against German heavy tanks. Unlike Soviet guns, which relied primarily on mobility and tactics, the 17-pounder combined tactical sophistication with sufficient penetration power to defeat Tiger and Panther armor from frontal aspects at reasonable ranges. Captain James Mitchell, commanding a 17-pounder battery with the British Guards Armoured Division, employed tactics directly inspired by Soviet methods. We position multiple guns to create crossfires that prevent German tanks from presenting their strongest armor to all threats simultaneously. The key is coordination and patience. By late 1944, German tank losses to anti-tank guns exceeded 80% on all fronts. The weapon system German doctrine had dismissed as tactically irrelevant had become the primary killer of German armor across Europe and the Soviet Union. The implications extended beyond immediate tactical concerns. German industrial capacity was being devoted to producing sophisticated tanks that were destroyed primarily by relatively simple anti-tank guns. The economic efficiency of anti-tank weapons compared to tanks created unsustainable attrition ratios for German forces. A ZS-3 anti-tank gun cost approximately 8,000 rubles to manufacture and required a crew of 5 men. A Panzer IV cost approximately 100,000 Reichsmarks and required a crew of 5 men plus extensive training. The mathematical advantage of anti-tank guns over tanks became overwhelming when production capacities were considered. Soviet factories produced over 100,000 anti-tank guns during the war, compared to approximately 100,000 tanks. German forces faced a strategic situation where every tank they lost was confronted by multiple anti-tank guns, and replacing lost tanks required significantly more resources than replacing lost anti-tank guns. The Battle of Berlin in April 1945 demonstrated the ultimate evolution of anti-tank tactics in urban terrain. Soviet forces had perfected techniques for employing anti-tank guns in city fighting that made German tank operations virtually suicidal. Feldwebel Ernst Kessler, commanding one of the last operational Tiger tanks in Berlin, described the final battles. Every street corner concealed anti-tank guns. Every building provided firing positions we couldn't suppress. We lost 5 Tigers in 2 blocks of advance. The anti-tank crews knew exactly where we would appear and were waiting. The final statistics validated the title of our story. Analysis of German tank losses for the entire war revealed that anti-tank guns were responsible for 83% of German tank casualties on the Eastern Front and 77% of tank losses across all theaters. The weapon Germany completely ignored had become their primary nemesis, destroying more German tanks than all other causes combined. Enemy tanks, the focus of German training and doctrine, accounted for less than 15% of German tank losses throughout the war. This strategic blindness reflected deeper problems within German military culture. The emphasis on technological superiority and individual weapon performance prevented recognition that warfare had evolved beyond simple technical comparisons. Victory required integrated systems where relatively simple weapons, properly employed, could defeat sophisticated equipment used incorrectly. The transformation of anti-tank guns from dismissed weapons to primary tank killers demonstrated that military effectiveness depended more on tactical intelligence and institutional adaptation than on technological advancement. Soviet forces succeeded because they developed doctrine that maximized their weapons' effectiveness while exploiting German tactical rigidity. German forces failed because they continued applying obsolete doctrine even when faced with overwhelming evidence that their assumptions were wrong. The intellectual courage required to admit doctrinal failure and implement fundamental changes proved beyond German institutional capabilities. Modern military forces study the anti-tank gun phenomenon, an example of how technological superiority can be neutralized by tactical innovation. The lesson applies beyond armored warfare to any situation where institutional thinking becomes disconnected from battlefield reality. Today's military professionals understand that weapons are only as effective as the doctrine governing their employment. The most sophisticated equipment becomes useless when applied according to obsolete tactical principles. Conversely, simple weapons can achieve decisive results when integrated into innovative tactical systems. The German tank crews who learned too late to respect anti-tank guns paid a terrible price for institutional blindness. Their sacrifice provides enduring lessons about the importance of doctrinal flexibility, the danger of technological tunnel vision, and the necessity of adapting training to address actual rather than anticipated threats. Klaus Brenner returned to his family farm in Bavaria after the war and never spoke publicly about his tank experiences. But in private conversations with his son, he emphasized the lesson that had cost so many lives. Never underestimate a weapon because it seems simple. Never assume your training covers every threat you'll face. The enemy studies your weaknesses while you're celebrating your strengths. The 83% figure represents more than a statistical curiosity. It quantifies the cost of strategic miscalculation, institutional rigidity, and the failure to adapt doctrine to battlefield reality. Those young men who died in burning tanks paid the price for decisions made in planning rooms far from the front lines. Their legacy serves as a warning to future military professionals. Doctrine must evolve as rapidly as the threats it addresses. Training must focus on actual rather than preferred enemies. And institutional humility must overcome technological pride when survival depends on acknowledging uncomfortable truths. The anti-tank guns that destroyed German armor have long since been scrapped or placed in museums. But the lessons they taught about warfare, adaptation, and the deadly consequences of strategic blindness remain as relevant today as they were in the smoke-filled battlefields of World War II. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now and don't forget to subscribe.